Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. This episode, I'm really happy to bring my conversation that I had with Juliet Hooker. Juliet is the Royce Family Professor of Teaching Excellence in Political Science at Brown University. She's a political theorist that has many of her main interests in racial justice, Latin American political thought, Black political thought, and many others. She is the author of the current book, Black Grief, White Grievance, Democracy and the Problem of Political Loss, which is the book that we talk about in this conversation. We start the conversation by talking about why racial justice is so prominent now, despite racial injustice always existing. So what is it about this moment that we're talking a lot about racial justice or racial injustices? We talk about loss, what it is, how it's political, and we also talk about anticipatory loss. We ask the question are we essentializing race? Do we focus on it too much? What's the right amount of focus? How much should we be focusing on this? It's a really nice bit of the conversation there. We talk about many white Americans and anticipatory loss. We talk about symbolic and material loss, democracy and political loss, class and inequality, how civil rights is used today, Black maternal health, public grievance, and many other topics. I really enjoyed her book and the conversation because her book really pushed some of my thinking, which was great. I always love it when books do that, when they push my thinking and they make me think about something differently. And she was an absolute delight to have a conversation with. I really enjoyed her way of explaining things, her way of navigating topics that aren't easy to have all the time. And I think she has a really, really great voice for talking about these issues. Obviously, her brilliance and her research shines through. And so it really was a big treat to have this conversation with her. As always, you can find this conversation and all of the conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. Also on YouTube. Get over there, subscribe, like, share. Much appreciated to everyone that does. And now I bring you Juliet Hooker. I am here with Juliet Hooker. Juliet, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I am greatly looking forward to speaking with you.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation as well.
Yes, for sure. So you have a book out. It is called Black Grief, White Grievance, The Politics of Loss. This is out through Princeton. And so I'm excited to talk with you all about this. Before we do, why don't you tell listeners who you are, what your professional academic background is, and what you're currently up to.
So I am currently the Royce Professor of Teaching Excellence in Political Science at Brown. I am a political theorist, and I work primarily on questions of racial justice, Black political thought, Latin American political thought, and just thinking about citizenship, belonging, how we come to form bonds of solidarity. And I've been, doing this work for quite a while. And this latest book really came out of trying to think about that moment when the protests erupted in Ferguson and the emergence of this very visible protest movement, and then the sort of backlash to that, followed by the Trump presidency, things like January 6th. And so it really is about thinking through how, it's the result of trying to think through over the past couple of years, what are the things that are driving contemporary racial politics in the US right now?
Yeah, no, that's great. Obviously, there are heated topics for people of different backgrounds and persuasions. And so it will be fun to wade through the waters with you. So I guess one just kind of jumping off point before we talk about loss. You talk about the idea of loss a lot. I want to get to that. What do you think it is about currently that is so particularly animating for people? We've had racial injustice forever, right? For a long time, since the country was been in existence and prior. But you mentioned Ferguson, which was what was that 2015? Is that right? I think that's right. And then obviously 2020 was a big year, et cetera, all the way up to current. There was racial injustice before 2015, but it does seem though like there was less, I guess, eyeballs on it, or there was less discussion about it. Doesn't mean it didn't happen or exist. But what do you think it is about this moment now, of why people are, a, interested or talking about it, and b, I guess, so animated about it?
So I'll say a couple of things. One is, as you say, there's been racial injustice throughout the history of the United States, and there has been both mobilization to keep racially hierarchical and unjust status quo, and mobilization to change that throughout the history of the country. I think we were in a moment in the at the start of the 21st century, if you will, where there was a lot of hope that the US, particularly with the election of Barack Obama, the first non-white president, that the US was really in perhaps this post-racial moment where a lot of the country's histories of racial uh, tension and division had been overcome. And I think the backlash to the Obama presidency, the rise of the Tea Party, a real radicalization in some ways of certain people by his presidency, led to this moment really of backlash. And at the same time, I think that the juxtaposition of having a white president, a black president, I mean, in office at the same time as you had this ongoing issue, right, which didn't just start with Michael Brown and Ferguson or Trayvon Martin. It had been ongoing of police violence against um, Black people. That juxtaposition made people really say, "What is happening here?" And then, the sort of very militarized response to the protesters in Ferguson and those images of, people being tear gassed and these, military these police in this military style gear against protesters, I think really started to bring attention to this issue. And then, of course, you have the emergence of the movement for Black Lives and this really sustained protest movement, which we hadn't really seen, at least around racial justice issues, really for at least at that scale had not been seen in some time. And so I think all of this, was in the background. And then you have right the pandemic, and folks are at home. There's time to pay attention, and the killing of George Floyd happens. And I think this is really something that really, mobilized a lot of people. And you have these massive demonstrations. And I think now we're seeing both that for a lot of folks who it really became, I think, galvanized into thinking about racial justice that is ongoing. But you also have a lot of people whose response was to say, this is going too far. And so we also are in this moment of backlash, I think, against that moment of mobilization.
And yes, it's very interesting how, I was, I'm old enough to remember some of the stuff that happened in the early 90s around racial injustice. I'm not old enough to remember stuff in the 60s or 70s, but there are certain kind of moments, or these kind of big moments where they kind of break through to kind of a national attention or a certain time frame. And it's interesting how, yeah, sort of with 2015, but really, yeah, after 2020, and just kind of, I feel like a lot of these discussions around race and racial injustice have just have a lot of legs. And I'm sure there's some impact of the internet and social media, et cetera, of course. But I think your uh, points there are really nice because it's this idea of this juxtaposition, which I think makes a lot of sense. Of we're having one way in which the country. I mean, I always thought it was a little silly for people to say a post-racial society. I don't know how realistic that is. I think even Obama came out and was like, I don't know how realistic that is either. But it may be aspirationally. But yeah, and then that kind of immediate backlash. And I mean, I know President Obama has, had criticisms from all sides, and then many people say he didn't do enough for, African Americans or for certain people of color, and then other people say he did too much. So it's just really interesting that someone that was not radical in many ways got so much backlash, which is interesting. So let's talk about this idea of loss. So the subtitle for the book is The Politics of Loss. So how do you define loss, and with that, how that's more than grief or suffering? You make a particular distinction of what loss is, and how it's political, right? So I guess the question would be there is, well, couldn't you have loss and it be non-political? So yeah, what's that distinction between grief and suffering, and how is loss political for you?
This is a really good question. So, I mean, I think loss is it's an experience, a human experience, right? We have all experienced loss in some way. Um, it can be something from the death of a loved one to, I mean, we just in the news right now, right? The earthquake in Morocco, natural disasters, climate disasters. We've also all, maybe lost an election, or had or candidates not win. So there are many forms of loss. And in this book, I'm particularly concerned not with all those kinds of losses, but with political loss in particular. And I argue that political loss is a category that we can think about in the following way. So losses in part become political because people mobilize around them. So, it's not always clear that something will become a political issue. And often activists have to make that visible in order for something to be taken seriously. So if you think about something like mobilization around AIDS during the height of the AIDS crisis, right? That was a really important moment of activism where folks were saying, look, this isn't just this, individual thing that's happening. This is a problem that the state needs to address. This is the result of lack of care and concern because of who's primarily dying. And so there was all of this activism that made this instance of loss something that that people were making the case that we should all care about. So that's one way I think in which loss has become political. Another way in which a loss is political is if it's the result of state action or inaction. So, state action is pretty clear, right? If you have agents of the state who who cause harm in some way, right? That's a pretty clear example of loss. Inaction is also a way in which something becomes political, right? So if you think about, let's say there's contamination from toxic chemicals, and the state chooses not to do a cleanup or doesn't let people know before they move into that area, right? There's ways in which the refusal to act is also what makes a loss political. The other way I think in which I talk about losses as political is when they're the result of these kind of structural forces. So they might look to be individuals. So you might think, for example, one of the things that I talk about in the book are is an example of W.B. Du Bois, who loses his son as a result of diphtheria, and of the denial of medical care, adequate medical care, because of segregation. And so something like this isn't just an individual instance of loss, it's the result of these wider patterns of injustice that then lead to these individual losses. So these are the kinds of things that I am referring to when I talk about political losses. And it's not just grief, because when I'm talking about loss, I'm talking about, an experience of harm, um, of injury that people then mobilize around and that they make a claim about, right? So another way in which I talk about loss in the book is that, it can, in some cases, losses that people mobilize around are anticipatory, right? They haven't actually happened. So if you think about, for example, people today who are mobilized by things like great replacement theory, or who are mobilized by the changing demographics of the US, they're making a claim that they're being displaced in some way, right, by the changing composition of the country. But that isn't the case yet. So it's a form of anticipatory loss that people are being mobilized by. And it's, and this is, and so people might grieve, right? Um, Something that they think is being lost, but it's not just grief, because one of the things that I talk about in the book is this the 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 fact that political loss involves often, right, this political mobilization around around harm or injury. So it's the move from grief to grievance that is often what you see in political loss, right? That people then become activists in order to try to get some response, to get some redress for their losses. So if you think about, the mothers of the movement, the women who lost children to police violence and then become activists in order to try to bring attention to that problem, or think about the kids from Parkland and their parents who become activists for gun rights in the wake of deadly shootings, right? So this isn't just, it is people who are grieving, but they're also doing something else.
I like how you explain the differences there, and how it kind of has its way of positioning itself within a kind of a political system. Obviously, there are groups and there are individuals that are at play within a political system, but I think that framing is helpful to see kind of the whole kind of gestalt of it. So you start the book by talking about white folks, right? And not always in the best ways, right? Which is probably fair in some regards. I guess one before we get to the that part of it, I guess a question I was thinking about. This is a kind of a preamble to this. Is so this is kind of your wheelhouse more than it is mine. So you can answer this very very well. I assume, but many people will say, listen. Well, there's some people that kind of just deny the concept of race. Some people that maybe go the other way with it. But do you think that there is um, looking at certain issues or looking at people or groups through the lens of race is one lens, and some people may say that that is the ultimate lens, that is the most important, and other people would say the exact opposite, that we gotta move away from doing that. So, in your mind, I guess, how do you tackle this, right? How important is race currently, and how important should it be? And why is it important to look at some of these issues, such as loss or political mobilization or other things, important to see through loss as opposed to socioeconomics or gender or certain other types of status? Why do you think race is essential, I guess, in this way, or is it, or how much is it? What do you think about that framing?
That's a very good question. Um, I think I would say that, personally, I think about these issues in my work from an intersectional perspective, right? So I don't think that there's only one form of structural injustice or inequality that shapes our lives.
Mhm.
They're all, there are many of them, and they affect people in different ways. Some of us are privileged in some ways, and subordinated, marginalized in others. So I think that's my starting
Mm.
point. In terms of the question of why focus on race in the book, I think in part it is a response to some of the. So one of the things that I argue in the book is that contemporary racial politics in the US is being driven by these different mobilizations around political loss that I frame as Black grief and white grievance, right? So the emphasis is on um, contemporary racial politics. But I also think that one of the reasons that I frame the argument in that way is because I think sometimes in political science there is a tendency to not pay attention to race in a way that skews the way in which we think about what's happening in terms of U.S. democracy right now, right? So if you look at a lot of political scientists, they're very concerned about polarization,
Mhm,
right?
mhm, mhm,
And the argument is we're too polarized, and that's making it difficult for the political parties and people of different political ideologies to work together, and it's tearing U.S. democracy apart. Now, that's one way of looking at what's happening. Another way of looking at what's happening, if you take racial politics into account, is that part of what you see is that where racial justice is concerned, that some of the moments of, let's say, um, when there was less polarization and more agreement with the parties, were some of the moments where you had, very entrenched
mm,
racist status quo,
mm,
right? So the 1950s, when you had Southern Democrats who were pro segregation, there was some agreement between the parties, but that agreement wasn't good.
mhm,
I mean, it didn't lead to positive outcomes for US democracy in the sense, if you're thinking about it as a multiracial democracy. So part of what I think is important in this moment is that we need to think about how it is that these things are interacting together,
mm.
right? So it's not just polarization, but what happens when we think about polarization through the lens of these cleavages around, do we preserve the racial status quo or do we try to change it?
Hmm. I like the way you frame that because I was curious as reading through the book. I mean, obviously, race is this is a very central part of the book, and so I was wondering uh, some of the context of well, what else is there, and how is that? And I do appreciate the framing of that. So you, I'm gonna read something, and I want you to elaborate on this, I guess. So you talk about um, how white folks engage in anticipatory loss, and I'm curious about how widespread you think that is. Whether that's universal for all white folks, or is it a majority, or just some? And you mentioned early on in the book that that I'm quoting you here. So is it, yet whiteness is not monolithic. Not all white citizens respond to loss with refusal, and also that you say my analysis of white grievance is thus focused on a particular response to loss among a subset of whites, and then you explain how you use white and whiteness. So when you're talking about white Americans, is it really for kind of elaborate on if I go outside and I just see a white person, like they're gonna have this idea, or is that too stereotypical? What's I guess uh, the subset of the group, or who is this kind of directed at, or who are you kind of specifically uh, referencing?
So this, again, also a very good question. Um, I think what I'm trying to think about here is to think about, the folks who are animated by or who feel moved by this rhetoric of white grievance. And this idea, right, that there's a displacement of, the sort of central role of, for some people, of white men in particular in this country. And for others, it's really more about feeling like there's too many opportunities for other groups and that these compensatory efforts are going too far. And so when I talk about, this subset, what I want to acknowledge, right, is that not everybody responds, has responded to, these efforts to try to address the U.S.'s history of, racial injustice in the same way, right? So a lot of the 2020 protests were multiracial. There were a lot of white people out there protesting against racist violence. There are a lot of folks who support, for example, taking down Confederate statues or other racist monuments. But I think there are those who don't, and who are very clear that they don't. I think it's also important to think about this as maybe not just those clear cases, right? So the rhetoric around, for example, when people talk about, for example, voter fraud in these big multiracial cities or cities that are primarily non-white, there's a clear kind of subtext there, which is that their votes are less legitimate, right? That they should have less say in how the country's run. But there are other ways in which I think this response comes through, right? So for example, if you think about something like, there's this idea that one way to address, for example, disparities in hiring is to have programs that have incentives for non-white groups to, for example, be brought into certain professions. Some people might respond to that by saying, I think that it is unfair to white people. And I think that is an example of right, a refusal to see this as, to grapple with the entirety of the history of racism and the ways in which, trying to address that history will require programs or policies that do try to address a history of differences in state policy where some were favored and some were not. And so part of what I'm trying to think about here is to say, how do we think about that, right? How do we think about what our response is to these claims? And if our response is to say something is being taken away from me, rather than to stop and say, okay, what is the history that this is trying to address? And what kind of society do I want to live in? Do I want one that addresses the historical wrongs that it has engaged in? Or am I going to have this sort of knee-jerk reaction of saying, oh, I feel like this is taking away things from people like me? Right? So that's what I'm trying to address when I say it's not everyone. But I think there are people who are responding in that way, right? Where they see gains for other groups in this zero-sum way as a loss for them. So if you think about, a good example of this that doesn't have to do with race is something like marriage equality, right? So why would you care if non-straight people get married? How is that taking away from you? But there are people who literally feel like that is a loss for them, right? So that for me is an example of when you respond to something um, by seeing a gain for others as a loss for you, as responding by turning that into something that you're aggrieved about.
So I think kind of what you're saying there with the first point, uh, I feel like a lot of white people that I've known and interacted with would never admit that. Now, there are certainly plenty of white folks that maybe would admit that. And they're like, yes, this, you know, if certain people of color are getting ahead, then that means that, that means just less opportunity for me or other people in my community. There's certainly. But it becomes more nuanced and complicated, I feel, with some white folks who will be like, of course, I want people of color or different backgrounds or immigrants or whatever to have a chance and opportunity, etc. But you get more of the, if you will, kind of implicit stuff, right? Kind of the stuff that's underneath the surface where it comes out. But even there, I guess a question I have about that is, mm, if I'm trying to understand the root of what you're saying. So many times, um, people may be indifferent and or just have less of an opinion, and or will say, "Well, I'm against this thing that someone's not able to get ahead or they don't have an opportunity, but I don't fully agree with the way in which that's being done. I do want this to change. Could we find other ways of having that change where people are able to have that? But I just don't like this particular way." Which again, I'm not saying that there has to be a kind of uh, permission granted or something like that, but in terms of dialogue, of national dialogue, or even between
Mm-hmm.
groups, where it's like, okay, well, well, how do you want it? And, why is that a problem? I think that's fair to ask. But what do you do in these
Mm-hmm.
kind of middle-ish, nuanced ways where it gets more complicated? Where it's like, yes, I agree with many of these things. Then there are many people that will say, well, if you're not against taking down statues, then you really don't care about what I'm saying. And some people would say, no, I just think maybe there's a third or fourth way of doing that. That's one example. Maybe it's a poor one, but there are other things that are even more complicated. What about that kind of, that kind of dance? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complicated issue because I think there are people who would say that they have strong anti-racist commitments, but when you look, for example, at what um, you know, at the kind of policies that they support, it becomes more complicated. One of the distinctions that I make in the book that I think is helpful for thinking about this is between symbolic and material
Mm,
loss. And what I mean by that is, symbolic loss for me is something that is, you know, it doesn't mean it's not, it's not important, but it might be, for example, something like taking down a statue, which is a material
sure.
thing, but at the end of the day, it's not affecting your ability to get a job. It's not affecting your ability to get an education,
Right.
right?
Right.
Or something that actually a lot of people get very upset about, casting in films, right? So
Hmm.
the whole idea of people in these popular franchises like Star Wars having more characters of color. A lot of people were very upset about that, or the Little Mermaid being black. These things that you're like,
Hmm.
who cares? Why do you
Hmm.
care? But some people are very upset by. And so those are things that I put in the category of kind of symbolic
Mm,
loss, right? That they're not really materially altering people's life chances, but they do create this sense for some of displacement.
mm,
And and part of what I would say is I think that there's quite a few folks who are like totally, who are maybe not totally fine, who are very much okay with symbolic loss,
mm,
right? They don't care about their go, Black Little Mermaid, let's, totally fine with these forms of with having a black president and black first family, all of these things, but that, but are more, I think, but then issues, it becomes more complicated when we're talking about material loss.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's some work that I cite in the book that looks at, how some of cities in blue states, right, that are supposedly have these majorities that are all for, climate justice, racial justice, all these things. When you look at their tax policies,
Mm-hmm.
how they fund
Mm-hmm.
education, when you look at all of these things, they're actually not that progressive.
Yeah.
There is actually real
Mm-hmm.
resistance to actually changing, for example, things like school funding, to trying to build low income or middle income housing in certain areas, right? So those are more material changes that I think is where you start to see some of this resistance that's really about, okay, in principle, I might support these goals, but it becomes more difficult when it might mean, okay, I might, in order to do that in my backyard,
Mm-hmm.
that might require me to support a transformation in my neighborhood that might affect the price of my home,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
you know?
those are the cities that change the name of the school and the streets, but they don't change the tax policy or they don't change the housing or education policy. Right, right, right. Which, in some ways, I mean, I don't think it's better or worse, but it definitely feels a little hypocritical in some ways. And maybe people, there's some ignorance there, but I think in a lot of cases, it's easy to do sometimes the symbolic thing, and it's much harder to do the more material thing. Again, each situation is different. So I guess how does then like how there there seems to be again um there is this kind of I guess there's a bunch of steps to this, but for some white folks it does seem to be very difficult for them to recognize black suffering, or even the reverse, that they can't do that, or it's very difficult, and they'll push for that they're sort of this white victimhood kind of thing, which is interesting again on a racial playing field. I'm leaving out poverty and class and things like that. It's a little bit different, I guess. But why do you think it's difficult still for some white folks to kind of recognize that? When I talk to different types of people, um, I think at the end of the day, you want people to see somebody as a human, as a person that has a family
Mhm.
and cares about many of the same things you care about, and acknowledge that things are a little bit different. It's not saying that you have to do anything about that or you have to take the blame for all of that necessarily, but acknowledging at the very least that's a little bit different if you're black or if you're brown. And I guess like kind of acknowledging the a potential experience that someone that is a person of color, their experience in the world, that seems, just the acknowledgement of that, still very difficult for a lot of white folks. And I feel like it does become a kind of strange inwardness of like looking at them, or what do I have to play in this, or what do my ancestors have to play in this? Is it some of that resistance, or is it just ignorance, or is it I mean, in some cases it is just racism, but what do you think it is that has still this resistance, or this, well, what about my victimhood kind of thing? It does that kind of bouncing back. What do you think this is so difficult still?
So I think there are a couple of things that are useful to think about here. One of them is, I think that there's one of the things that I talk about in the book is this idea that white grievance is in part motivated by this desire to preserve racial innocence.
Mm,
And what I mean by that is that um, it's very difficult for a lot of people to accept that you know this country is founded on ongoing injustices
mhm,
that are just as foundational as the sort of, you know, um, commitments to freedom, et cetera, that we like to point to when we think about, you know, what the U.S. stands for. And so I think that there is both a sense that it's somehow for some deeply threatening to acknowledge that, right? That is somehow making, is this discourse of that is taking away from the this idea of U.S. exceptionalism. But I think the other part of it is this notion that I'm not wanting to be implicated in that past, right? So even folks who might, for example, be willing to say, okay, yes, of course, everybody now thinks, slavery was a terrible thing. But once you get closer to home and you start thinking about things like residential segregation, right? And we know from the work of sociologists that not only is home ownership the largest source of wealth for many Americans, but that wealth has created a white-black wealth gap because of patterns of racist mortgage lending, residential segregation, all of these policies that were implemented or redlining things that were supported by the federal government and the banking system. And so I think once you start thinking about it in that way, and then it becomes more of a question of, it doesn't mean anybody's going to come away and take away your house, right? But it might mean, right, that you might have to think about, I don't know, your grandparents in a different way, or you might have to think about why they moved to the suburbs in a different way. And I think people find that very difficult to do, because it might mean that you have to grapple with a kind of complicated past, not just for the country, but your family, your neighborhood, your city. I think the other thing that I would say in response to that is that there's also the fact that we, as a country, right, we have not been the history of this country is not one where there has been the same level of care and concern for the suffering of everyone who is a part of the country, right? So there's been, I think, one of the things that I think that I'm trying to get to in the book is that, there's been a way in which Black suffering has been accepted, right? That it's been seen, and that it's ends up being seen as this thing that actually drives racial progress, right? So and this is, the result of things like, I talk about this in the book about, how we expect Black protesters in particular to take on this kind of self-sacrificial role, right? To be the perfect protester and to take, right, private grief, like Mamie Till Mobley, the mother of Emmett Till, and then put it to public use to try to bring about racial progress. And I think there's, that on the one hand, while we might, there's a discourse around these as heroic moments, there's a way in which we come to then be far too comfortable with, right, the suffering of some as this thing that eventually will lead to a better outcome.
Yeah, I definitely want to ask you about that. I know it's towards the end of the book that I was, I don't want to say happy, but I was glad that you pointed that bit out because I think some people don't realize that or they don't put the two and two together, and it's like, oh, well, wait a minute, like this is somebody's, they lost a family member. Like this is something that is, I mean, that's a hard time, and it many times if it's a national spotlight or whatever, they don't really get to kind of mourn and grieve that in the way that, somebody I mean, these are private citizens many of the times. And so many other people, when they don't have a national spotlight, they're able to, have their privacy. And a lot of times people don't. And then you have people making political statements about it one way or the other. And it just becomes kind of a circus, terribly so. So another theme that comes up in the book, which is which is interesting. I'd be curious for you to give us the full download here. Is how essential is loss for the centrality of democracy, and that we accept this reality for all groups in their particular way. So for example, how do we understand this again? This idea of loss politically as being connected to democracy. That you make that jump, that connection, and I'm curious as to how you do that and why it's essential to democracy.
Yes, so in that part of the book, I'm building on the work of Daniel Allen, who, made this argument that loss is a central civic capacity, right? It's something that we all have to learn to do as citizens because we're not always going to win
Mhm.
every political argument, or we're not always going to be able to, have our preferred outcome. And so, and so one of the things that she says, and which I then build on in the book, is this idea that in democracy, we're you know, we expect, or right, the way in which we think about democracies as this empowering thing, right? So you exercise your power in conjunction with others, and you get your preferred policy initiatives and programs adopted. But in fact, the experience of democracy most of the time is of losing,
Yes. Yes.
right?
Typical
So,
outlooks.
how many times have we all not gone to vote and then our candidate loses,
Yeah.
our issues
Don't
don't
pass.
win
Right.
the
Right. Right.
day,
Right.
right? And we have to grapple with that.
Hmm.
And we have to, for democracy to function, we have to accept that.
Hmm.
And we have to, I mean, assuming that, all the rules were followed and it was fair
Sure.
and legitimate,
Hmm.
a fair and legitimate election. But if we don't, I mean, what happens is that democracy falls apart and we get these kind of um, turns to authoritarianism. And I think we're seeing
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
very much so happening in, a lot of states in the United States today. Um, um, if you look at what's happening in Wisconsin right now, for
Hmm.
example, where there was a Supreme Court justice who was elected, who's going to change the composition of the court, and now she hasn't even done anything, and the legislature is talking about impeaching her because they don't want to accept the will of the
Hmm.
voters, which was to elect her, which they knew would change the composition of the court. And that's an example of saying, oh, I will not accept that
Hmm.
loss. And I will change the rules after the fact so that I can continue to exercise political power as I want to.
Hmm.
And when you have that happening, um, you know, you don't have democracy.
Hmm. Hmm.
I mean, democracy is you're turning to authoritarianism
Hmm.
at that point. And so that's why I talk about loss as being central to democracy, because part of what I want to say is that maybe we would be maybe it would be easier. I mean, those moments are difficult, right? It's difficult to
Oh,
have your
for sure.
candidate lose. It's difficult to lose a policy battle. But part of what I think um, might help is if instead of telling people, oh, what democracy does is it empowers you and you get to say, yeah, it does that, but it also means that sometimes you lose. And that's as central to being a good democratic citizen as it is
Hmm.
to go out there. Yes, you still keep trying you don't give up,
Hmm.
right? You still keep trying until you get what you want. I mean, until you can create a majority around your position. But losing, right, accepting loss is just as central to the experience of being a good democratic citizen.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the most obvious example of this is in terms of elections is, I mean, you could have whatever opinions you have about Hillary Clinton, but she did concede. She did accept the loss. It was fair. I mean, there was the whole investigation to it afterwards, and it looks like it wasn't as much as some people thought it was, and there was certainly some meddling. But the point is that she accepted the loss and conceded it. And I mean, that was super tough in a lot of ways. But she did that. And 4 years later, we had a president that definitely lost. There was no foul play. We all saw that and know that. We had plenty of recounts, and we did the whole court thing. We did it the way you're supposed to, and didn't. President Trump didn't accept the loss. I don't think he ever conceded, and that's not how democracy works. It's just not. And so this wild juxtaposition, excuse me, 4 years apart, of a presidential election where, you see that. And I also think it's this weird thing of, anytime you have to, when you're a bad loser, you just have to make a tax on either the person or you make a tax on uh, uh, some of the institutions, right? So if this doesn't agree with what I want it to agree with, then, well, it must be the court's problem, or it must be that Secretary of State's problem, or it must be the AG's problem. They must not have. And at a certain point, if you keep doing that, then you just don't have anything, right? It's just like, how long are you going to keep doing that, really? And to be fair, I mean, there is corruption in different places, and but I find all of that stuff so frustrating, because there is certainly corruption everywhere, and there is in the United States, but not nearly as much corruption as there is in so many other elections in so many other countries around the world, where that is a legitimate challenge in many ways. And so I'm glad that you set it down in the book, of this idea of how, yes, democracy can be powerful, but also sucks sometimes because you lose. And if your policy or your amendment or whatever topic you were voting for, your person or whatever doesn't win, you gotta take the L, and that's how it is, and it's very, very difficult. I guess the last thing I want to say about white folks, and we can move forward on this, is um, class. So what is this intersection
Mhm.
of white grievance and class? I talked about this a little bit in the beginning, about how understanding loss, or excuse me, grievance through the lens of class isn't quite enough, and how how can, I mean, anybody generally, but how can white folks in particular learn to accept that, like, look, you're going to have political loss and you don't have to make it a grievance. Like, what does that kind of look like in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think this question of class is super important, right? Because one of the ways in which people often, try to explain this moment of backlash or white grievance, is to say that it's really a class phenomenon, right? That it's about the so-called white working class. Um, and for me, that's problematic on a number of levels. One of them is, my empirical political science colleagues have shown that, in fact, there was support, for example, for however you want to, for Trump, as in his attempt to be reelected, across income levels, right? So this idea, and I mean, if you take that as a kind of proxy, let's say, for or something of the sort. Um, so the point of this is to say that I think we make a mistake if we think about this as simply a work, an issue of class. There are a lot of folks, I think, who are very motivated by the sense of grievance, who are not in fact suffering from economic loss or dispossession. And so I think that's one thing that's important to keep in mind. I think the other thing to think about is that historically, one of the places in which you've had, for example, that has led to moderating of kind of racial resentment has been unions.
Hmm.
So it's in fact possible, right? And it has happened historically for white working class people to make common cause with other working class
Hmm.
people. And so I think we make a mistake if we assume that it's simply social class. And I think the other thing to think about here is that, one of the reasons that folks are attributing, let's say, the undoubted economic losses that a lot of parts of this country are experiencing, that they're attributing it to, let's say, an influx of immigrants or whoever it is because elites are telling them that, right? It's because there is a whole infrastructure of folks who are saying, this is what is happening to you and why. So I think that this is the other thing that we need to think about. What role are these narratives and this that right blame some racial other for what are undoubtedly, wildly unequal life chances, and enormous widening of inequality, socioeconomic inequality in this country, that it's being attributed to these things like immigration, when in fact it has to do with other kinds of policies that favor, let's say, the 1%, or that don't really create, an adequate safety net, that don't really make education affordable without going into, enormous amounts of debt for a lot of people, right? So there are all of these policies that are creating these huge inequalities, but we're being told to blame them on these other um, folks who are then racialized or othered in these ways.
Yeah, I think something along those lines that always kind of resonates with me is that many of the inequalities in the United States are going to impact many people. It's going to impact you, it's going to impact me, it's going to impact everybody, no matter what your gender or race is, right? It's going to impact you, and many times negatively. I think what is strange to me of why people have a hard time with this is it is going to negative more often than not, unfortunately, negatively impact women, people of color, etc. And that's not to say, I think people don't hear this, that it doesn't impact white dudes or white women. Of course it does. Of course it does. But there's another variable or another two or three variables that are going to unfortunately disadvantage them. And I don't understand why it's hard for people to see at the least ripple effects of, generations of laws or policies that at the very least just didn't give a shit about those groups. And so I'm not sure why that's hard for people to really see. You don't have to go so far as to say like your grandparents made the laws that put them there, but it's, you can understand that like, hey, there's a history here that sucks. And how do we, change that? But you can't really change those things if you don't recognize, at the very least, the ripple effects of some of those things and say, okay, well, how do we, you know, how do we make sure we change this differently? We don't exclude people, but we certainly don't want to, if there are more variables, and I don't think it's victimizing them either, if there are more variables to consider for certain groups, they're going to need more resources. They're going to need more things. That makes just logical sense to me. But I think sometimes maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's the rhetoric or the way people come out that people have resistance to it. I don't know. But I'm hopeful that people sort of get that and they see that, and you don't have to feel bad about yourself or something like that. It's just like, okay, how do we acknowledge, and then how do we, kind of try to move to change that? So let's talk about, sort of we talked about white folks a lot. So let's talk about black folks a little bit. You talk about many types of resistance and protesting and all these things. So I'm some more easy topics to discuss with no controversy. So how do we, how do you think about nonviolent resistance? What does that mean? And in 2020, yeah, we heard a lot of criticism about. So this is how it is in my memory, in my collective memory, if you will. Protest for sure, rallies, marches, and rioting. I think is fair to say. Um, how do we feel about all of those ways, and what's the utility about that in terms of some people say that some of those or all of those are different modes or different expressions of injustice, and we can't, uh, kind of manage or monitor all of that. People are going to do what they're going to do, but some people, many people say it's too far, things like that. So, how do we understand different types of resistance, violent or nonviolent, different types of protesting or rioting? How do we understand some of these kind of the boundaries and contours of these things?
Yeah, this is obviously, a very important question. I think one of the things that I think needs to be the starting point for thinking about these questions is to think about the different ways in which we perceive protest, um, and how that shapes the way in which we think about what's acceptable. So so one of the things that I argue in the book is that we have this kind of romantic account of the civil rights movement of the 1960s, right, which has become this kind of iconic moment of civil disobedience where people were super civil and they were, smartly dressed, they were the perfect protesters, and because they allowed themselves to suffer violence without retaliation, that this then changed um, hearts and minds, and people came to support their cause. And this is this narrative that we have, and it then shapes subsequent protest movements, right? So if you aren't quote unquote civil in that way, if if there happens to be some sort of violence that breaks out at a protest, then this becomes, you're departing from this model and it's illegitimate. Um, Now, one of the things that I think is problematic about this is that, first of all, it misunderstands, or we are misremembering our history of the 1960s, which is that these weren't these, you know, it wasn't that there was widespread support or for civil rights protesters, or that people saw them as these ideal protesters that they embraced. There was a lot of actually even criticism of Dr. King, right, who has become this very non-controversial
I
figure
mean, he
now.
did get killed. I mean, so
Right,
I mean that's
right.
the obvious thing there, right? I mean, goodness.
hmm and then the other part that we tend not to look at is think about somebody like Colin Kaepernick,
Hmm.
right, who was, or other athletes who knelt during the national anthem. That is as peaceful a protest as you can imagine,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? There's absolutely no violence, and people were absolutely equally upset
Hmm.
by that and found that problematic, right? So part of what I want to I think we need to understand is that this perception of what constitutes a violent protest, or who's rioting and who's protesting, is very much informed by these historical precedents and racialized. I cite this quote in the book of Ron Johnson, the senator from Wisconsin, who said about the January 6th rioters that he wasn't concerned about them, and he didn't call them rioters, right? Um, but he would have been if they had been, he said, BLM or Antifa
Hmm.
protesters. And the point of this, right, is because there is this sense in which we see some people as already, right, violent, and no matter what they do, their protests are illegitimate or are examples of rioting. And others, even when they do riot, right, we perceive them, or some will insist on saying they're patriots and they're law-abiding citizens, right? So part of this of what I think we need to keep in mind when we have these discussions is that these these assessments about what constitutes peaceful protest versus rioting are very much themselves weighted in these ways. And also, I think, and so, and so if we take that into account, I think one of the things that it allows us perhaps to see is that these moments um, of tension or of confrontation um, are always complicated and depend on how people in who are participating in them on what they do, but also on how those of us who are outside of them are reading them. And so, part of what I argue is that, when we make these claims about civil disobedience, we're also need to think about, how is that imposing a kind of um, expectation that certain kinds of protesters can never meet because they're already always perceived as violent or rioting or whatever, no matter what they're actually doing.
So I have two questions here. One is about civil rights movement, and one is about rioting. So there's um, 2 points I guess I want to make, or two subpoints I want to make about the civil rights movement, which I want to ask you about. The first is I recently talked with Hajari Esdiha. She wrote this book. Oh, I'm forgetting the title. She'll be terribly upset at me for forgetting it. But she wrote this book about Dr. King's legacy and civil rights movement. And she mentions this idea of collective memory and how people will kind of co-opt now this his legacy and act like it was all they were all for it from the beginning, of course, right? We were always for MLK. We were always for civil rights, but kind of what you're saying. There's this romantic narrative of like, yeah, it was and it's that's the same people that are now kind of very, enthusiastic about it are the same people that would have had the most grotesque, vulgar things to say at the time. And so, it's quite obnoxious. Not to mention that in her book, she talks about different types of groups that use the civil rights movement, the spirit of it, and there's complications with that, right? For some folks, it might be that it's just, is this just for African American community? Do immigrants get the right to kind of take from some of those themes? Does the LGBTQ get to take from some of those things? Because everyone wants to have their civil rights movement, and there's this kind of uh, way in which it becomes into our memory of how we think about this, right? Where there's a kind of there's this myth around it of sorts, right? Like it's obviously a thing that happened in all these things, but it's more of like it starts to become larger than life in some ways. And it's important to remember the realities, which is sort of some of the things you're saying there. So I'm curious about what you think about how people co-opt kind of that movement. Second point, sub point on that is I have a friend of mine who, she's talked about this a little bit. Her and I have had conversations about this about, how do you have different um, specifically within the Black community, different kinds of ways of advocating for yourself or for justice or for things like that at different times. I think the example she gives is that during slavery, well, an underground railroad made sense, right? Because your literal life was in danger. You wouldn't do an underground railroad in the 60s or 70s, at least not so on the nose in that way. So protesting and marches and all those things made sense. There was, okay, we have some standing here, but we want equality truly for in our laws and how we vote and housing, all these things. So protesting and movements in masses of people made sense. And so I think her question, which I resonate with, is, well, maybe in 2023, maybe we need to find another alternative way, right? There are people that are, we've had a Black president, we have a Black vice president, we have senators and representatives and people in the Supreme Court okay, there are Black folks that are in positions of power within the system that we have, for all of its faults, and there's good parts to it as well. Maybe we need to be more creative in how we have, for this time, a different way. That's not to say that protest or things like that aren't good or useful or things like that, but maybe we're putting too much energy at this time frame of history into something that is 60 years old at this point. We need to update to find different ways of doing that. So, sorry, this is a lot. So, what are your thoughts on the whole kind of, civil rights movement and people co-opting it now with different groups? And what do you think about how this ties into some of that romanticism piece? And then this idea of what are other, maybe more effective ways of trying to, if you will, protest or call for uh, uh, kind of equal rights for Black folks and maybe other folks at large.
So the co-opting of the memory of the civil rights movement, I think, is a real problem. You know, I cite someone in the book who said that MLK would have been ashamed of Black Lives Matter protesters, which is just, you know, mind-boggling. But I think it's of a piece, right, with this sense that this sanitized memory, actually, that we now have of the civil rights movement and of the 1960s and of how change happens, right? So there is this sense, oh, they were very civil, and then everybody agreed, and there was, this not, it was not conflictual, and change happened. And, this goes back to my point about polarization, right? Which is to say that actually the way that change happens is often messy and difficult. And it's not this very, often the result of these very civil debates, right? That what we need to, so I think part of the problem with this sanitized memory of the civil rights movement is that it focuses folks on questions of civility rather than on questions of how social change happens, right? So we focus on how people are protesting. Are they protesting in the right way so that we will admit that their demands have merit, rather than focusing on what are their demands, what's the problem that they've identified that we need to fix, right? And I think this is a pattern that we see over and over, right? So we deflect away from the harm or the injustice that people are actually trying to make visible, and instead get into these endless debates about, are they protesting in the right way? Um, and this is in some ways, I think, your friend's point is well taken, right? So So I think the question is, how do we think about what effective forms of Black politics, other forms um, of um, protests against or demands for um, you know other forms of justice, climate justice, whatever the issue may be. Like, what do those look like today? And they're not going to look exactly the same as they did, 60 years ago, 20 years ago. I mean, if you think about something, um, you know, um, just think about abortion, right? And how things have changed in terms of where we are today, just from, 2 years ago, in terms of the landscape, the overturning of Roe, right? So we're in this, I think we are in a moment where, these folks are having these debates, and the question, I think, if you look at, for example, the movement for Black Lives, there's a lot of um, disagreement among various groups and various activists about, right, do you try to keep up, right, um, mass protests in the streets? Do you try to work through existing political parties? Do you try to work through? Do you organize to try to get punitive prosecutors out? Do like where do you focus your energies? And these questions, I think, are ones that people have been asking themselves for they were asking themselves these questions in the 60s as well and before then, right? So Bayard Rustin has this essay when he talks about from protest to politics, and there's you know I'm not endorsing his analysis there. There's many things in it I disagree with, but I'm just using it as an example to say that these questions about, what's the most effective way to try to bring about social change are absolutely persistent questions. And in this moment, I think we're facing an added complication, which is that the U.S. has never been a full democracy,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's because it has excluded various people or only partially, allowed them the full status of citizenship. And now we're in a moment where you're seeing these anti-democratic measures, things like attempts at voter suppression, right? The attempts, for example, for in states where people don't want college age kids to vote because they think they're going to vote a certain way, right? There are all of these ways or restrictions on various forms of voting. So there are all of these ways in which part of the problem too with U.S. democracy is that um, you know it's not clear, right? People say, oh, vote. But voting um, is only going to get you so far if the institutions are set up in such a way that your vote cannot really be translated, even if you win a majority, or it's set up in ways to that make certain votes count less. So I do think this is a moment where there are all kinds of questions that we need to ask about the structure of US democracy, right? How do we make it actually a more effective democracy? And how do we do that in a way that allows people to feel like they can actually implement change?
It it reminds me of this conversation I had with a friend not that long ago, where I'm I'm definitely a liberal. I would say probably more moderate liberal in a lot of ways, and he's definitely not. And he asked me, he goes, you can always hear people's points of view and their perspectives, and he asked me, he goes, what's the thing that you get animated about? Like, what's your like passion? He's like, yeah, I care about climate change. Yes, racial injustice, wealth inequality. Like, what's like your thing? I said, I have the very boring but really important thing I really care about. The thing that gets me going. He goes, yeah, what is it? I said, gerrymandering. I think which is the most unsexy, boring thing to really, but I get really, really invested in that because that is I'm really, really invested in how do you reform institutions. And that's I mean, that is connected with, some voter ID laws and things like that. But gerrymandering is essential because it's not. I could go on and on about this, so I won't. But it's one of those things where it has to deal with your sense of what you call home. It has to deal with your sense of community. It has to deal with your sense of space. It's how you identify it with your class, with race. It touches on all of those things. And if you have a district in where you're voting with people that have none of your other interests, that's not to say that you disqualify those people, but there should be a way, and if you're trying to build local communities in a way that coalesces around certain things, you should not have that where your interests are not taken into consideration because you have you draw the line so you get all of this so that way you can get someone that doesn't accurately represent you in Congress. That's preposterous for me, and I That's like that's my thing. That's the thing I get. But it's just it's such a, and you're like, oh, that's just very, like impersonal and cold, and you don't have like the real emotional kind of causes, and it's like, I mean, yes, maybe, but we all need that. If we don't have that, we're all screwed. We need to have things that are accurate to population, to our census. I mean, I got really upset about the bullshit that the Trump administration was doing with the census in 2020. I mean, that's really important. That's really, really important. So, I have other friends that care about many other issues, but that's one. And so this comes up for me of like, this is something we need to, how do we have mobilization on, yes, it's not going to have a cool, catchy, hashtag or or social media campaign, or it's really, hard to get people interested in that. I get it. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think it's Obama and uh, Holder. I think that's right. They have this, or they're loosely associated with this redistricting campaign to try and make it fair and equitable and things like that. And I greatly applaud that work. So, anyways, that's my tangent there. My, but that stuff's important. That stuff's really important for
Yes,
moving many of the things we've discussed. So,
absolutely. It's the nuts and bolts of democracy, right? So, one of the things about thinking about what is it that we're asking of people is, when people criticize, for example, young people, right? This sort of, often repeated thing, young people don't vote, and
uh-huh.
this is a problem, right? But maybe people don't vote because they don't think that their vote will actually make a difference because of these ways in which we've set
Yeah.
up the system, things like gerrymandering, et cetera, where they know that it is in fact an uphill climb. And so I think that in addition to saying, oh, vote, we also have to, like you said, think about the ways in which the system is set up so that people can't actually um, have their interests represented or work through, right, the sort of accepted channel. So when people say, well, why are you rioting or why are you doing this? Well, maybe people feel like they don't actually have a way of getting heard or having
Mm-hmm.
their interests represented because those other channels have failed them or are set up not to listen to them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, I know people talk about this in kind of in a way that's maybe not always fair, but in Georgia and there were other places where people were saying, like, I'm not gonna go wait in a line that long and might not even be able to get to vote. I mean, that's unacceptable. That's unacceptable. That should not happen at all in 20, well, this is 2022, but in 2023, that should not happen. That just should not happen at all in any place for the, what is it, the greatest, biggest, whatever country. I mean, that's unacceptable. And so, yeah, there's issues there. And so, it's a thing we'll have to keep working on. And there are many issues. And so I always tell people, like, well, we need folks that are very, very passionate in doing the work on racial injustice and climate change. And I'll be over here in a little corner. I'll cheer you on, and I'll support all those causes too. But I'll I'll be worried about the redistricting, the real nerdy, boring thing. But it's important too.
Well, and your example also, is related to one of the things that I hope that this book will get us to think about, which is, whenever there is an election, right, there's always these articles lauding the heroic people, and they are heroic, who stayed in line for 8 hours waiting to
Hmm.
vote against the folks who were, and there'll always be the sort of elderly African American,
Hmm.
person who's like 80 years old and determined to have their vote cast. And those people are heroic, but the question we need to be asking is, why are we asking them to be
Yeah, of
heroes?
course.
It should not be this difficult to
No, that's
vote. And
ridiculous. Yeah,
so
absolutely.
so part of it is that, when we say that this is a civic virtue, what we're not looking at is what are the civic
Of
deficiencies
course,
in our democracy
absolutely.
that require
Hmm.
people to be heroic.
Yeah, in my view, it is so much easier to vote in so many other countries. It's on a Sunday, they have a day off, all these things. Like we make it, and I don't think that's by accident. We make it impossible sometimes for people to vote. There's only a certain amount of time they're open. There's only, a handful of people. The machines aren't up to date. It's on a Tuesday in the middle of November. You know what I mean? Like it's just there's ways we can make this so much easier, and we actively don't, and that is intentional by people in power, and it's frustrating. It's at the very least, it's frustrating. So, but yes. So okay, one topic here I wanna ask you about is um, I was curious. When I read books, I try not to have expectations of where they're going. So I didn't kind of pick up on this. So I'm glad you mentioned it in the book, which is Black maternal grief, right? And you give a kind of history from different thinkers. You talk about some modern things, such as in films and things like that, about how you mentioned this idea of how grief has been central, for better or for worse, for representations of for Black women and Black womanhood. Um, I mean, aside from it being very important, why did you decide to fit this in here with the topic of the books you're considering, and why is it important to to consider that and to understand this?
Absolutely. So, one of the things that I talk about in the book is this idea that Black politics has really been mobilized by these moments of public, private grief turned public mourning, right? So the funeral of Emmett Till, which is often credited with really galvanizing the civil rights movement, and these other moments of folks being killed, and then this mobilization, right? This very public grief that then becomes a catalyst for mobilization. And part of the reason to focus on Black maternal grief in particular was because that you know that arc, right, has actually been gendered in particular ways, right? So women are cast often as those who grieve, and men are often the victims, those who are being grieved. Um, and and this, I think, creates particular burdens and expectations. And part of the chapter is really trying to think about, I begin the chapter on Black maternal grief by talking about Erica Garner, and, who died so young after becoming an activist after her father, Eric Garner, was killed. And she's a kind of odd example, right? Because she wasn't his mother, she was his daughter. But part of using her as an example was to say, one of the things that happens when we focus on these moments of, you know, people who turn from grief to grievance, right? The people who have to become activists in the wake of the killing of their loved ones, is that we not only lose sight of the toll on them, right? So Erica Gardner, who dies so tragically young, but also of all the other ways in which people are dying that is not at the hands of, let's say, the state or agents of the state, like the police, right? So she dies after, she has of a heart attack, and she had had complications after giving birth to her children. And we know there are huge disparities in Black
Hmm.
maternal mortality and Black infant mortality. And so part of it, I think, of really focusing on Black maternal grief is to say, um, what are the ways in which people are dying that are more ordinary, let's say, not being killed by the state, that we also need to pay attention to. But also, right, how do we think about these patterns and think about the added burdens that people take on in order to become activists and do this work of trying to make, um, you know, change and bring about racial justice, something that benefits all of us, but that is an enormous burden for for those activists.
Yeah, and I wonder how much of it is. I mean, that's a tricky kind of landscape to navigate through. I can imagine, right? I mean, which is yes, how do you want to be productive? How do you want to be useful? But also, how much of the your own grief are you dealing with kind of externally as a way of trying? There has to be so much, kind of going on with that. And I have the same uh, kind of worry that you have that you talk about in the book of not of how the activism or too much spotlight on one person when they've lost someone can be tricky. It can be difficult for the person involved, and people want to think that this one incident represents everything, and or you're getting too much criticism and heat. And I think that it is a tricky thing to kind of to navigate for. On that point, I guess you make this one distinction between salvaging and repairing, and why that distinction is important for understanding loss. So, what are you trying to say between these two concepts?
So what I'm trying to get at is this idea that um, I think one of the central narratives in the book is this idea that we ask certain people to be heroes, to be political heroes, right? So we ask them to make these sacrifices over and over for the sake of sort of repairing the injustices of US democracy. And this, to me, sets up, a number of problems. One of them is who are the groups who are constantly being asked to do this important political labor, right? And who is exempt from it, right? So these differences in who is expected to be heroic in this way. But the other thing is that I think when we talk in this language of repair, or we think about these moments as moments where we can, make these fixes, that we sort of are already um, setting up expectations about the scale of change, right? So if you think about, home repairs, or you're repairing your car, right? The idea is you don't have to go out and buy a new car, or you don't have to go and get a new dishwasher. You can repair the one because it's pretty good. It just had a part that needs to be replaced. And part of what I think the distinction between repair and salvaging can help us to see is that when we begin from this assumption that the, you know, let's say U.S. democracy is fundamentally sound, but we need to tinker around the edges and fix these little things. We don't see the scale of the problem, and we also limit our imaginations, right? So, we might, allow people to vote by mail, but we won't look at the ways in which, something like the Senate, right, um, over represents rural areas at the expense of urban areas, right? So part of what I want to suggest when I talk about the distinction between repairing and salvaging is that salvaging, which means, right, you take maybe from a shipwreck, or you take something that has been discarded and you build something new from it, is to say, how do we expand our imaginations to think about, okay, if we want to have a democracy that is truly equal for everyone, what does that look like? And how do we not assume that it's healthy and well, and we just need to make these little minor adjustments?
Yeah. I guess the last question I have for you is this idea of the one thing that resonates with me in conversation in the book is this idea of democracy means you're going to lose sometimes, which is true, and I think it's hopefully we can have um, less losses for important causes, of course. How do we, as a country, continue to have a democracy, or we strive for democracy for everyone by wrestling with some of the dark chapters of our history and the ripple effects of that, and try to move forward with this kind of acceptance and empathy and true inclusion. How do you see, your book contributing to some of those conversations we need to have?
So I hope that the book will help us to think about how we might think about loss differently, and how we might come to see that if we come to see that democracy is always involves loss, and if we come to think about the fact that people are mobilizing around loss, that we can think about ways um, of approaching it differently. So one of the what I mean by this is, often when I've presented parts of the book in the past, people, their reaction is like, oh, it's, but loss is so hard, right? How do we present it not as a loss, but as a gain? And I kind of resist that impulse in part because part of what I want to say is it's okay to lose sometimes. And we have to learn to sit with loss. And some of us have, unfortunately, had to have that experience, and others have not. And that if we can all accept that we are not always, that we are sometimes going to lose, that might give us a better orientation to how to be good democratic citizens than saying, oh, if you're not winning, or being, you're a loser in a very pejorative sense, right? And think about even like that designation, you're a loser, right? So we have no way of thinking about, this question of that loss is a normal human experience, right? And that particular in democratic politics, it's inescapable.
I totally agree. Well, the book is called Black Grief, White Grievance, The Politics of Loss. This is out through Princeton. Where are the best places to find yourself, or any place that you want to direct people in particular?
So you can order. The book will be published on October 3rd, and it's available for pre-order now at the Princeton University Press website or at Amazon. And you can go to my website if you want to see where I'll be speaking about it in the next few months.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Yeah, that's great. Everyone should get out there and hear you speak and get the book. And my only regret about this conversation is that we didn't talk about any of your work in Latin America and many of the studies there. As the child of an immigrant from Central America, that's depressing for me. We didn't get to that, but that just leaves enough room for us for next time. So it's been such a wonderful honor and privilege to have you come on and talk about your wonderful work and how you're trying to think through these issues. And I really had a wonderful time talking with you about it.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. It was a great conversation, and I guess you'll just have to have me back on to talk about
That's right.
Central America.
All righty. Thanks so much.